Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Association of the United States Army's headquarters in Northern Virginia. It's our honor to be talking to General Carter Ham, who heads this great organization. And we're meeting just before the great AUSA general meeting, which is the nation's leading military professional development seminar, as well as its largest trade show. Sir, how's it going?
Go, Vago. Thanks. We're ready. We're going to start on Monday, October 14th, run through the 16th. The team is ready. The Army is ready. There's a lot of excitement and enthusiasm. New leadership at the Army, a new secretary, a new chief of staff, a new sergeant major of the Army, several other key senior leaders across the Army. So there's an energy and enthusiasm this year that I'm very excited about.
And it's great. I mean, it's always a time for very, very important messaging. Each show has a theme. It's also a tremendous, one of the best opportunities to also catch up with old friends. As somebody who's covered the Army for almost 30 years, it's always great to see a whole bunch of folks who I've covered over the decades, and it's always an honor and pleasure to see them. But talk to us about what this year's theme is, and what are some of the messages we're going to hear from the new Army leadership, which is actually technically not that new, right? I mean, General McConville has been part of the team for a long time. Ryan McCarthy was a very, very able deputy, and now he's the secretary formally. What's the theme of the conference, and what are some of the messages we'll hear?
Well, first, you're right. One of the aspects of the association's annual meeting, it is the Army's family reunion. So it is 30,000 of our closest friends who come together and have an opportunity to reconnect. So that's an important part of the annual meeting. But the substantive part, the professional development side of it, begins with the theme of this year, which is America's Army, ready now, investing in the future. And I think that conveys where the senior leadership is. The unbreakable bond that the Army must have with the nation is that when the nation calls, whether it's today or tomorrow or the next day, the Army has to be ready. So there'll continue to be a focus and an emphasis on near-term readiness, emphasized clearly by General Milley in his role as Chief of Staff. But then the second part of this, investing in the future, really is where General McConville and his role as the Chief, Secretary McCarthy as the civilian leadership of the Army, posturing the Army for a different operating environment. We've all talked about this now, the return of near-peer competition, and so the Army has to posture differently. So those will be the overarching themes. The one big add that will be a bit different, I think, will be to hear from General McConville and his very explicit emphasis on people. And I think that level of emphasis will be somewhat different than what we have seen in the past. And I suspect that we will hear from senior leaders across the Army during the annual meeting, programs on talent management, how things are going to change for officers, non-commissioned officers, soldiers, Army civilians.
It's the chief has made that clear, and there are there's a lot of conversation that at this time of very, very brisk technological change, that the key is not just developing that technology, which the United States has been good at, although our lead has declined in part because of the democratization and the proliferation of technology. So Russia and China have access to a lot of the same technologies, but is the quality of the people and how to raise more innovative leaders for the future. You spent an entire lifetime in uniform. You still continue to serve the Army in your current capacity. What do you think are the keys to quickly adapting, to building that kind of adaptive learning, rapidly changing force that the Army has always had, but seeks to accelerate with Futures Command and a number of other initiatives? What do you think are the keys from your standpoint as a lifelong Army leader?
So I think there are a couple of different keys to this as they move forward. Most of my time in the Army was during the Cold War. Big Army, I think 700,000 plus in the active Army when I first enlisted. Very, very big, focused on the Cold War, and as General McConville would say, industrial era personnel systems. Basically, what we were concerned about is what's your rank and what's your specialty. And all infantry staff sergeants are equal, and so you can plug and play. All armor captains are interchangeable. In today's market, that's not possible. It doesn't serve us well in terms of recruiting and retention, where leaders, Army leaders, want to have more of a say in their career and in their professional development and in their education models. Certainly, Army families have a greater say now in processes. So I think we're going to see a much more interaction between the individual soldier, irrespective of rank, and the Army in terms of deciding what kinds of what do you aspire to? What's the right kind of education that will lead you to that objective? The Army will still and must always remain the ability to say, okay, thanks for that. We know that's what you want to do, but I need you here right now, and maybe we can get to your goals a little bit later. So I think it's a more personalized approach. It's also recognizing that there are skills resident in the civilian workforce that the Army needs, and so lateral entry coming into the Army at a higher rank, either non-commissioned officer or Army civilian or as an officer. We typically do that with physicians and other specialties, but maybe we need to do that for other specialties, so electronic warfare, cyber, maybe supply chain management. So I think just what is exciting to me is General McConville has kind of opened the aperture and said, let's look at all of this and how do we make our Army better.
He has been extraordinarily forward-looking, and there's always been a conversation since you brought up the direct commission at a higher rank thing. That's kind of interesting because there are those who sort of work their way up, right? I mean, I busted my butt to become a major or a lieutenant colonel. What is the force management piece of this that will make the folks who feel like they earned it and may look at, for example, somebody who just came in as a major or comes in as a lieutenant colonel, maybe a little bit askance? What's the right way to get that cultural piece right? Because everybody is at the same team, and the reason the Army did grab a very successful executive, Carter Ham, and brought him in as a major or lieutenant colonel or a captain or anything else was for a very good reason and for the benefit of the entire force. Do you think that there's some things to make sure that you get that right and it not create a potential resentment where, somebody who's a battle-hardened guy or gal may go, this weenie is wearing the uniform that took me 12 years to get, for example. Do you think that that's a kind of an important cultural piece to get right?
Well, they certainly have to address the cultural aspect of it. I mean, there is an Army culture, to be sure. And if you begin as a private and rise all the way through to sergeant major, you've been immersed in that culture the entirety of your adult life. But I think there's enough space in the Army to recognize that there are some specialties that is difficult for the Army to recruit, train, and retain on its own, and so lateral entry benefits the entirety of the Army. There's got to be a cultural component of that, to be sure, so that if you come in from the civilian life, let's pick cyber as an example. If you come in as a cyber expert, a network expert, and you're going to come in as a staff sergeant or sergeant first class or a captain or a major, you can't just walk in one day and put on the uniform and do it. We've got to do some training, some culturization. But I think the Army can do that. Again, what's most exciting to me is that at least now we're having that conversation. And as General McConville and Secretary McCarthy would remind us, what this really is all about is how do you make the Army better, and how do we widen the pool of talent that the Army considers to make the Army stronger, make the Army more effective. So another aspect of the talent management portfolio, if you will, that General McConville and Major General J.P. McGee, who leads the Talent Management Task Force, that they're looking at is the ability of soldiers to move more easily, more seamlessly between the components of the Army. Meaning, maybe you start off as a young soldier in the regular Army, but you want to go back to your home state of Indiana, and maybe go to college. And so maybe the National Guard is a great opportunity, right in your time of life. So you ought to have an opportunity to be able to move very quickly, serve in the National Guard. And then maybe a little bit later, maybe you get married, maybe you have children, and you find a different calling, and perhaps you want to serve in, say, civil affairs. Well, most of our civil affairs capability is resident in the Army Reserve. So maybe that soldier, maybe a sergeant by now or staff sergeant, ought to be able to move more easily, more seamlessly into the Army Reserve. So depending on your life situation, your family situation, your interests, your professional development opportunities, to be able to move from regular Army, Army National Guard, Army Reserve, back and forth, I think would benefit many, and I think would be an attractive part of the talent management package.
How is Futures Command is now about a year old. It's had some profound changes. Last year was a very important introduction. Obviously, General Murray leading this very, very important command. The cross-functional teams. I mean, I thought that they had replication machines because everywhere you went, there was one of the CFT leads was there at the show. We're going to have a lot of focus on that now. How is that process going? As you know, watching it from the outside, you know, there are some folks who say, "Hey, this is really tremendous and is putting some very appropriate tension in the system." Other folks are saying, hey, there's a prospect for disconnects. You get to see this and you advise the senior leadership on a candid basis on some of this stuff. How do you think it's going from your standpoint, watching this and interacting with that team?
So I think it's been really good. I believe that it was the right decision for the Army to establish Army Futures Command. My personal view, they picked exactly the right leader for that command to get it started, get it well on its way. But I also recognize, and certainly here in and around the nation's capital, it can never be fast enough. All right. So the fact that Army Futures Command has not yet delivered the next generation combat vehicle, they haven't yet delivered the replacement for the Apache and the Black Hawk. That's not fast enough for somebody, for some people. But I would tell you that from my perspective, what I've seen change in terms of the process, in terms of significantly shortening the requirements generation process to get information to the defense industry in months rather than years, allows the innovative spirit that is resident in the defense business across the United States to respond more quickly to Army requirements. So I think that's a big step forward. Certainly the cross-functional teams remain vitally important, and I think that's a great model for how the Army can approach the highest priorities, and then lastly, the fact that the Army, Big Army, and Army Futures Command have just remained ironclad on what those modernization priorities are. There's been no deviation. There's no waffling. These are our 6 top modernization priorities. That's where the money's going. That's where the leadership energy is going. That's been very helpful, I think, certainly inside the Army. Everybody understands that. To the industries that support those modernization priorities, they understand it. Lets them put their intellectual energy behind it, and Congress understands it. So we hope soon that'll result in a good funding for those modernization priorities as well.
Last question. It's the nation's leading defense industrial show. I mean, certainly you guys each year have been setting records. Fortunately, the funding picture has been looking positive. Are you going to be setting another record this year in terms of size and participation and scope? You mentioned 33,000, which is a formidable attendance figure. And do you think that the budgetary outlook is going to remain as positive as we've seen it over the last few years? Or do you see clouds on the horizon?
Well, we're under a cloud right now. We don't have the Army does not have an appropriation. The Army does not have an authorization act. They need both of those quickly in order to sustain the modernization effort. There's been some talk of a year-long continuing resolution. That would be disastrous. That would essentially freeze the modernization effort of the Army. So we're hopeful that when Congress returns, they'll take this on very promptly and get an authorization act, get an appropriation to the desk of the president, and start moving forward. Longer term, I think the general assessment from the Army has been the Army budgets of last year and what we hope to see in the Army this year are probably as high as they're going to be. They're probably going to stay about flat for planning purposes. And I think the Army is well prepared for that. It's one of the reasons why this rigorous prioritization is so important, to say, okay, no matter what the funding, we are going to fund these highest priorities, and then they will do, obviously the Army is large and does lots of other things, but those 6 modernization priorities will remain at the top.
And attendance, do you think you're going to set another record this year?
Well, I don't know if we'll set a record. We certainly will be somewhere above 30,000. One of the things that's encouraging to me about the registration so far, I think we are now 80 plus nations will be represented, and I think we're in somewhere in the nearing 20 other Army chiefs will come. So that part of it, and of course that fits very nicely with the National Defense Strategy of partnering with allies and others moving forward. It's always been important to the Army, and the fact that other nations are choosing to come participate and join with us. So we look forward to that very much.
It's an extraordinary meeting, something I look forward to every year, including the Global Force Symposium. Now, football is near and dear to your heart. Cleveland Browns, how are they going to do? And is Army going to beat Navy again this year?
Well, the second part of your question is much easier than the first. So clearly, Army's going for 4 in a row. There's no question about that outcome. And we wish Navy well. We wish that they win every game but one. And so we'll be in good shape. As far as the Cleveland Browns, too soon to tell. Big night on Monday night against the 49ers. We'll see how that goes.
Sir, Carter Ham, who heads the Association of the United States Army. Sir, always an honor and pleasure. Break a leg. What I think I admire about your team is, this is like a duck, man. If you were in these halls, seriously, it's very impressive. Just humming along like nothing's coming up, but it's the nation's one of the world's leading shows, so break a leg.
Thank you very much. It's a great team here. The staff here works very, very hard, as does the Army staff, and we have very close collaboration. It's going to be a great event, but yes, it's a lot of hard work. And come Wednesday night, when we present the Marshall Medal to General Dempsey, the former chairman, former chief of staff of the Army, there'll be a big party, and after that, everyone will just kind of collapse.
Sir, break a leg. Thanks again.
Thanks, Vago. Thank you.